In order for a user story to be considered a user story, really all you need is that business value statement. And usually that business value statement is created by a product owner. However, in order for a user story to be considered successful, it does need to have acceptance criteria so that the developers and everybody on the team who's working on the successful conclusion of that user story understands what exactly needs to happen in order for that user story to be considered a pass. And that's where you get acceptance criteria, and that's where we talk about some of the other letters in our acronym INVEST. First up, negotiable. Is there enough room to create the best possible solution? Here we want to focus on the end results and not any particular specific designs. You don't want too much detail, like, oh, it has to be a drop down list, or it has to be right here in this corner, or it has to be this particular this or that. You want to leave room for new discoveries. And it also helps develop trust and passion from your team when you say, this is what we need to get done, but I'm leaving it up to you to figure out how to get done in the best way. A great example that I like to use is, as a person who likes to work out a lot, I have exercises that I enjoy doing more than others. And when I go to the gym, I usually have a goal in mind. For example, it could be to train legs or to train chest or to train back. And I have machines that I prefer to use to do these activities. However, as anybody knows who's been to a gym, you don't always have the opportunity to use the equipment that you want when you want to use it. So in this moment, your user story, your acceptance criteria is that you're working out, let's say, your back. And if you can't get the equipment that you really wanted, then it doesn't matter because you just find something else that can also help you work your back. And it may not have been what you wanted, but you still get the benefit and the success of accomplishing working out your back. Another great example is dating. People with too stringent of acceptance criteria when they're deciding who they want to date sometimes miss out on opportunities to meet people who they might actually find interesting because they created essentially a filter that pushed out too many people, and they just end up missing out. Estimable. Is there enough detail for you to feel comfortable estimating this? So this is kind of the balance between negotiable to say, even though you want it to be negotiable, you still want to be able to understand how many areas of the code that this user story might impact. Understand roughly what needs to be tested, and to understand the impact for external applications. Without having all of these things, you might not understand how complex or simple a user story really is, and therefore you can't really accurately estimate it relative to other things because you actually have no idea what you're doing essentially. Which leads us to spike user stories. Essentially, when you have a user story where you have no idea what it's going to impact, you don't know what all applications you might be touching, you don't know what stakeholders you need to talk to, you don't know what processes might be impacted, that's when you create a spike user story. And the purpose of a spike user story is essentially to allow you to do the research necessary to get the actual user stories into a state where you can essentially estimate them. The outputs of a spike user story are not quite the same as a user story, whereas a user story has a shippable product, something you could test essentially. A spike user story might have something like an impact analysis, a new technology assessment, a process diagram, a business rules analysis, or even a prototype that'll allow you to say, hey, now that we have this information, we can go back to that other user story and properly estimate it. Testable is the last letter in our acronym, and it's also the same T that's in the acronym SMART for writing requirements or even defining goals. I mean, it basically means, how do you know it's done if you can't test it? So can you easily recognize a pass fail? Really, when you're doing this, you're doing it for your developer so they can have confidence when they say, hey, I've done the thing you've asked, that you'll look at it and say, yes, that is exactly what I was looking for. Some bad examples of testable acceptance criteria are that it's pretty, which is obviously very subjective, or it's better than it was before, because better is also very subjective. Good examples are a user is able to submit their timesheet, or a user is able to update their profile. If you want to level up your acceptance criteria writing, Gherkin is a great way to do that. Gherkin was created specifically for automatic testing for an application called Cucumber. and a gherkin is actually a small pickle, which is kind of clever. But basically, it creates some discipline in the way that you write acceptance criteria that makes it easier for your developers, maybe QA teams, or whomever to understand exactly what the expectation of a user story is, and the different scenarios in which a user story might pass or fail, or how they should behave in those different scenarios. Writing in Gherkin starts with a scenario, and this kind of gives the overall context of the test steps so we can understand what it is that's trying to be accomplished. Given steps are used to describe the initial context of the system. It is typically something that happened in the past, and it's okay to have several given statements, like you must be logged in, you must be on a certain particular page, or whatever it may be. When is the step that's used to describe the event or action that triggers the expected outcome. It's recommended that you only have one when step per scenario. If you have more than one, it usually means that you need to break up that scenario into smaller or multiple scenarios. Then steps are used to describe the expected outcome or result. So basically, the given is if this is true, the when is when I do this, the then is these are all the things I expect to happen after I've done it. The pros of this are automatic documentation. If you write all your user stories this way, you have a very good record of how the system should work. It's great for integration testing, and it increases efficiency across the team. The cons are essentially you have to collaborate more, and you can't be in a silo, which you can call a con, but in truth, it's making you better. An example of using Gherkin as your acceptance criteria might be something like this. So for this user story, as a Bank of America customer, I want to be able to log into my account on my mobile device so that I don't need to be at a computer to manage my account. The first scenario when writing this might be a correct login. So given that the user has input the correct username and password combination, when the user initiates login, then load the Manage My Account homepage. Notice that I didn't include any interface directives, anything about how the UI needs to work. All it says that if I have the correct username and password, when I initiate the login, I should be on my homepage. That username and password interface can look however the dev team and the people involved decide they want it to look. Also notice that by creating this first scenario, we've kind of already called out another scenario that needs to exist. So this is a correct login. So the another scenario that definitely needs to exist is an incorrect login. So the second scenario might be given that the user has input an incorrect username and password combination, when the user initiates login, then notify the user that they have input an incorrect username and password combination and highlight the forgot password option. Depending on the type of user story, you might have several scenarios, or you might just have one if it's that straightforward of a user story. But again, when a developer reads this, they understand all the different scenarios that they need to go through and all the different outcomes that they should be providing for. The definition of done represents everything that needs to be in every single user story, essentially every single time. This allows you to not clog up every user story by writing this out every single time, and thus kind of reduces the amount of documentation that exists into only what's necessary. All of these things need to be true every single time a user story is pushed to complete in order to truly call it complete. And they can be things like how you choose to code if you're doing peer reviews, or if there's a certain testing protocol that needs to happen every single time. It could be compliance with a style guide. It could be rules on how to deal with different bugs that come up for that user story. It could be which browsers it needs to be compatible with. All of those things that will be true every single time a user story is created can exist in this different document, so you don't have to put them into your user stories. These are some of the parallels between Waterfall and Agile, because a lot of the things that you're doing in Waterfall are indeed important. They just change in nature because of the fast-moving, fast-paced way you do Agile. So business and stakeholder requirements essentially become user stories or sometimes features. Functional requirements often becomes that acceptance criteria that you see in those user stories. And those standard requirements that usually end up at the bottom of every single requirements document essentially become your definition of done. So that's it on writing user stories. If you have any additional questions, as always, let me know in the comments and I will do my best to answer you there. And if it's a big enough question, then I'll create a whole new video and answer you there. So subscribe so you can see those questions get answered. And as always, thanks for watching.